Coming up, the world's largest iceberg is on the move. Scientists look into the melting mound's effects on ocean salinity and ecosystems.
It's not adding anything to the ocean that wasn't already there.
Also on the move is a voracious predator.
They're fire ants rafting, guys.
Fire ants in Australia prove their might as unusually heavy rains and humans threaten their queen.
They will essentially swarm their target and all attack in unison, stinging together.
But first, the US announces a new plan to rein in oil and gas giants with heavy fines for those with leaky methane pipes. Just 2 degrees starts right now. American oil and gas companies will be fined for emitting methane, according to President Joe Biden. It's a new plan that, for the first time, could mean millions of dollars in penalties on greenhouse gas pollution. How this would work is a proposed $900 charge for every ton of methane emissions that exceeds levels set by the Environmental Protection Agency. That fee would rise to $1,200 per ton in 2025 and to $1,500 in 2026. The plan follows another that requires fossil fuel companies to fix methane leaks on their pipelines, wells, and storage facilities. The US is part of the COP28 Global Coalition to reduce emissions of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas that in a span of 2 decades is significantly more potent than carbon dioxide in contributing to global warming. But exactly what checks are there to figure out whether a company is breaking the rules? Well, one organization thinks it has the answer. I caught up with the executive director of the World Benchmarking Alliance at the Davos meetings in Switzerland. The WAA says it has a system to assess the world's most influential companies in high-emitting sectors. Your company has outlined 7 points for a more sustainable and resilient world. At the top of the list is social transformation. How do you tackle extreme poverty, gender inequality, and climate colonialism when these inequalities are so profitable to some companies?
Yeah, so what we do is we have looked at the world and in terms of 7 big transformations you're referring to that need to happen for the world to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And as you rightly point out, we can't do that if we don't address the issue of inequality and social issues. And that also refers back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals that are about leaving no one behind. So when we then assess companies, because that's what we do, we assess companies and we bring those results into the public domain so that we can hold companies accountable. This means that, referring to your question, that whenever we assess a company, whether it's about climate or nature issues, we always integrate the social issues. So this is about the company's respect to human rights, how it's treating its workers, but also how it's using its public voice, how it's doing public advocacy, and how it is being basically an ethical citizen.
As your company rightly points out, there is no global accountability mechanism to understand where companies are today and where they need to be. And the company's processes and carbon footprint are essential for analysis. Is it hard getting this information, particularly from oil and gas companies, to calculate their impact on people and the planet?
So what we do is we build a methodology that is based on international standards for assessing CO2, but also for assessing human rights issues. What we then do is we assess the company based on what they put out in the public domain. So it is, what are they prepared to commit to, what are they prepared to report on, and that's the kind of data that we then use to analyze and compare the companies. Now, particularly in oil and gas, as you will know, there's a lot of state-owned enterprises, and the disclosures by these companies is often very limited. So what we then don't do is we don't make estimates, but we basically downgrade these companies for a lack of disclosure, for a lack of giving insight on how they're reducing their emissions, and to your point, how they are treating workers and how there is their respect for human rights. And in addition, what we do to that is we apply a specific questions around just transition. So how is it helping its workers and the communities in which they operate make the energy transition? And perhaps unsurprisingly, as most of the oil and gas companies by and large fail to come up with plans and that are leading towards a credible pathway towards Paris, they're also failing to bring along workers and the communities in which they operate.
In your company's 2023 climate and energy benchmark document, it's noted that
quote, with no set date to phase out fossil fuels, companies fail to make credible transition plans. Is that what you think will happen, since at COP28 the final text weakened the language on phasing out fossil fuels?
Yeah, I do think that we should, the language in COP around fossil fuels is weak, but we should also celebrate and cherish that the language is in there now. That is progress. It wasn't there for 20 years. It is there now. So we should cherish it. Ultimately, the way in how consequential that is going to be depends on states. And therefore, it depends on how we as citizens use our voice and engage with states. The oil and gas industry is fundamentally intertwined with governments, whether that is because they're directly state-owned governments, state-owned companies, or because they have strong ties with the governments in which they operate. So it is really, really important that we convince governments on the need to phase out fossil fuels, because that's the only way that investors will then follow that direction, and that's the only way that the fossil fuel industry will set on a real serious decarbonization pathway.
And what about promises to triple renewable energy by 2030? Do you think those promises will be kept?
I think yes. On the renewable energy, whether those promises will be met by whether that tripling will come from the oil and gas industry is very doubtful, because they spend way too much capital allocation on actual renewables. So that will probably come from other actors, being it states or utility companies. But I'm very confident that we'll get to that tripling of renewable energy. However, energy demand is also going to go up, right? Because of electrification, we're going to need much, much more electric energy. Now, so that means that only increasing the amount of renewable energy, which is massively important, is not enough, because we also need to phase out of fossil fuels.
Well, the law is becoming a vehicle for climate action. Over the past 5 years, activists and environmental groups alike have lodged cases to force domestic courts, forcing governments and corporations to act. Here's a look at some of these high-profile suits, cases, and their potential impact.
Climate lawsuits are on the march. Environmental activists are bringing cases to domestic courts that have the authority to order action.
Young litigants are suing their government for failure to secure their fundamental rights to a stable climate, or how interest groups are suing governments for failing to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, or how cities and states are suing oil companies for lying about what they knew about the impact of fossil fuels on the climate, and how that disinformation campaign led our leaders to make bad choices about how to build our future and the economy.
In the last 5 years, nearly 2,500 cases have been filed in courts as activists seek to hold governments and companies responsible for their role in ecological damage. In Brazil, the meat processing giant JBS SA and 3 other slaughterhouses are facing 14 lawsuits for environmental damages amounting to $3 million. Analysts say to keep an eye out for a 2024 case where a Peruvian farmer is suing German energy utility company RWE. He alleged they contributed to a glacier melting near his home, posing the risk of dangerous floods.
And we're taking to court one of the main emitters and historical emitters, which is one of the main carbon emitting companies in Germany, RWE. It's a company that has lignite mines, so brown coal, and also has lots of coal plants. And what we're asking them to do is essentially pay for part of the costs to actually protect the city and my client's property from a flood that could result from the lake up there in Palcacocha.
Another case to watch was lodged by 6 Portuguese youth against 33 European countries for failing to avert climate-related catastrophes, which they say threaten their right to life. The case is among the first to be heard by the European Court on Human Rights. There have already been historic victories. Dutch climate activists triumphed in a landmark legal case launched in 2019, dubbed People versus Shell, demanding the oil giant shrink its carbon footprint. It was launched by the environmental group Friends of the Earth, which is backed by 17,000 Dutch citizens.
De rechtbank beveelt RDS om via het concernbeleid van de Shell-groep de CO2-uitstoot van de Shell-groep en van de toeleveranciers en de afnemers van die groep eind 2030 terug te brengen met netto 45% ten opzichte van het niveau van 2019.
Within the thousands of lawsuits working their way through various courts and jurisdictions, could be the very real potential for change.
A massive iceberg, the world's largest, is drifting with the help of strong winds and ocean currents, and it's melting. Glaciologists captured the top layer of A23A, as it's been named, which is collapsing as waves crash into it. And the melting process is releasing large amounts of fresh water. The A23A broke away from the Antarctic coastline decades ago and began migrating towards the South Orkney Islands. It's measured at just under 4,000 square kilometers, which is bigger than countries like Samoa, Luxembourg, and Mauritius.
When exactly did the iceberg break away from the Filchner-Ronne ice shelf? And do we know what caused it?
Well, this broke away actually quite a long time ago. So it was in 1986, so before I was even born. But the interesting thing about this iceberg is it kind of broke away and then it got stuck. Because it's just so big, it kind of grounded on the ocean floor and didn't move there for decades. But we started getting interested in this iceberg again just before Christmas last year, because that's when it had been very slowly melting, and eventually it broke away from the ocean floor and started to leave the Antarctic continent.
Do scientists know why it broke away in the first place?
Well, icebergs break away as a perfectly natural process. So snow is falling all the time on Antarctica, and that gets compacted and forms ice. So if those processes are in balance, then Antarctica stays roughly the same size.
I'm curious about whether there's an ecosystem on this massive, massive iceberg. I guess what happens to the life, if there is, what happens to the life on it when it melts completely?
Well, there definitely are nutrients on the iceberg, and that will impact the ocean water when they melt. But there probably isn't kind of ecosystem in terms of things like penguins living on this. They would have left those areas before the iceberg floated away.
So I know that some scientists are concerned about the amount of water that's being released. Can this affect the salinity of the ocean?
Well, it is releasing fresh water. So yes, but obviously on a larger scale, it would have a local impact, but not a large impact over the whole ocean. I think we're more concerned about that in terms of the amount of ice that's being lost from Antarctica and Greenland as a whole. So not just from icebergs, but from melting below and above the ice. And because they're releasing fresh water and nutrients into the ocean, we often seen that we can have phytoplankton blooms that follow the ice shelf, the icebergs. So there can actually be some kind of positive consequences for local ecology.
All right, so this iceberg, we understand, is huge and is releasing fresh water into the ocean. What are the negative consequences of that?
It's already kind of displaced its own weight in the water. So when it breaks away and melts, it's not adding anything to the ocean that wasn't already there. And in fact, we can see some positive consequences of icebergs melting.
Is this iceberg a threat at all to cargo ships, to people at all, in terms of it floating away?
It's definitely something that will be monitored because it is just so big. So, for example, there are research ships and expedition ships in Antarctica that have gone quite close to this iceberg and been able to see it and actually take scientific samples, which is quite exciting. But obviously, they need to monitor where the iceberg is going, so it won't pose a danger. But at the moment, the iceberg's following a fairly predictable path. So a lot of icebergs that break off from Antarctica head up towards South Georgia in a kind of direction that's known as Iceberg Alley, because so many icebergs go in this direction. So at the moment, it's being monitored, but it's kind of going where we'd expect it to. So it's not too concerning on that front at the moment.
There's been a lot of news about the last year being the hottest ever recorded. What impact do you think last year's heat and possibly this year's heat will have on ice shelves across the planet?
Well, we do know that our polar regions are warming, and also in terms of land ice melting. So Antarctica and Greenland, when they melt and the ice goes into the ocean, that's adding something that wasn't there before, and that's when we get sea level rise, which is very concerning.
Are you worried about the level of warming that we see in the past 12 months and what that can mean for the next 5-10 years?
Absolutely. I've been worried about it for much longer than the last 12 months. That's why I've made my career working in this area. But I think it's never too late for us to start changing that. Obviously, it would have been great if we made more of an impact on stopping climate change decades ago, but there's still a lot more that we can do. And every change we make obviously is going to help reduce that warming. So I'm optimistic that things are possible. I just hope that people do actually do that.
You know, we're always talking about what people can do or what can be done on a massive scale to reduce global warming, but what can people do on an individual level? What do you recommend?
Okay, so a couple of things that I personally try and do is travel by public transport wherever possible, or walk or cycle. I also try and eat vegetarian as much as possible because the meat industry has a huge impact on our carbon footprint. But I think the most important thing that people can do is go out and vote, because the people that have the power to make those big, large-scale changes need to be the ones in power who are actually going to make them to benefit our climate.
Fire ants are considered a super pest in Australia, where authorities say the insects pose a grave danger to the environment and agriculture. The ants have been swarming as storms belt the north and eastern parts of the country. The fire ants' densities are increasing. They've already infested about 700,000 hectares of land. The country's Invasive Species Council is asking communities in southeastern Queensland and New South Wales to be on high alert as the ants move with flood currents on ant rafts they form themselves. Is the fire ants raft building something they do every time it rains? Or is that a consequence of unusually heavy rain?
What we know about fire ants is that one of the ways that they've adapted to survive in their natural environment in South America, that they're native to flooded wetland areas. And the way they actually survive heavy weather events is they can form rafts where they lock legs together and form a ball, which we call a raft, in order to protect the queen and save the colony during the flood event. So it's particularly during heavy wet weather, and usually it's often when there's a river that has broken its banks, or a wetland that is in a flood season. And they'll use this to survive, first of all, but then also to thrive. They'll reach new land and reform their colony and begin again. So it's really quite fascinating the way a scary invasive like this can survive in this kind of weather.
That's so fascinating, because ants in general, once they live in soil, they build drainage so the nest never gets flooded out. So finding out that these ants can create rafts, and I guess natural explorers too, is really fascinating. Is this ability to adapt partly why they feared so much?
Yeah, so fire ants themselves can be lethal to humans. There are examples overseas where fire ant attacks have actually resulted in human fatalities. They have a response where they will essentially swarm their target and all attack in unison, stinging together, and their venom can be toxic. So, you've got essentially rafts, which are balls of toxic stinging ants floating in floodwaters and arriving at new locations. So, absolutely not something that we want spreading around the world. And they are spreading. Not only can they spread in floodwaters, they're also great at stowing away in human cargo. They crossed an ocean to get to Australia. And last year, they were able to arrive in Europe as well, which is a great concern.
Where are the fire ants from originally?
So originally, fire ants are from South America. They're from a region called the Pantanal region, which is central South America. And they've evolved there to live in the world's largest flooded wetland environment. So they're well adapted to surviving in dry weather and in flood and in rain. And from there, they were able to spread to the United States in the 1930s. And there's now a well-established fire ant infestation in the United States that's beyond eradication. And that's where Australia's fire ants have come from. They arrived in Australia about 20 years ago in container freight through the port of Brisbane. And they've been something we've been trying to deal with ever since. We've been pretty successful in Australia at eradicating fire ants in a couple of locations, but there's now about 700,000 hectares of land around the city of Brisbane, where Australia's largest fire ant infestation remains. And that's where this flood footage, fire ant raft footage has come from.
Has Australia been trying to purposely cordon off and contain the ants? Or is the aim to just eradicate all of them?
So in Australia, there is an eradication attempt going on at the moment. We're trying to kill fire ants. We're trying to prevent them from being in the country. And there's a very significant, large and well-resourced eradication program currently underway. But we know it will take at least another 10 years to eradicate fire ants, and probably about double the amount of resources that have currently been allocated to the project. So ultimately, fire ants will cost Australia something like $2 to $3 billion Australian to eradicate. But it's projected that if they get out of control and spread across Australia, they will have a $2 billion Australian per year economic impact. So it's not something we can afford to live with. In the United States, they're costing $7 billion US per year in terms of the economic impact they're having over there, because they cut agricultural output, they impact tourism, they make it hard to do sporting events and festivals and things like that. So they also undermine infrastructure, electricity and water in particular. That infrastructure gets attacked by fire ants and undermined. So they can cause quite a significant amount of damage if they get out of control. It's just a tiny ant, but when you've got millions of them and they reach very high densities, they can have a very significant impact.
I'm guessing all ants are foragers or scavengers even, which means they can help clean the planet. Are the fire ants beneficial to Australia in any way?
Not really, unfortunately. And this is the problem with an invasive species like a fire ant. It's not native to Australia. It's disrupting the food chain here. It's impacting biodiversity and habitat. And if it gets out of control, it will cause problems for insect populations. It decimates other ant populations in the area that it occupies. It feeds on hatchlings and ground nesting birds, attacks turtle populations, and fire ants will eat anything. So they even attack the stems and root systems of vegetation. So native plant life also gets impacted by fire ants. So it can take a long time for people and the environment to adapt to introduce species like fire ants. And it will be a very expensive adaptation for Australia if we need to learn to live with these things.
And that's our show. But before I leave you, there's a new film out with a relatable perspective on the climate crisis. The protagonist is a young pregnant woman played by British actor Jodie Comer, who goes into labour while the city she lives in, London, gets submerged in floodwaters. The film is called The End We Start From, in which an environmental disaster forces the characters to flee the city as the country descends into chaos. Take a look.
Make a wish. I don't understand what this rejection of the world means.
Where are you going to go?
Home. Going home.
I think when these types of things happen in an area that you don't live in, when it's far away, you can turn a blind eye, or you could become desensitized, or you have the option not to think about it. And I think there's just something about seeing an area in which you relate to, either where you live or you associate yourself with, see it in a film like this. I think people will probably connect to it in a personal way, for sure. Yeah.
I went on this mad I want a baby quest. Yeah. No, I didn't stop. We didn't grieve properly. You just head down, get pregnant, get through it. And I think I only wanted one so I could stop being so afraid of dying. So I could have something of my own that I would die for in a heartbeat. A second.
That's okay. I don't think anyone has a baby for altruistic reasons.
I'm sorry, the ambulance service is currently in heavy demand. We will respond as soon as a call handler becomes available. You're currently in the queue.